So thank you, Tom. I'm in the enviable position of following Senator Warner and preceding lunch, and we're running a little behind. So I will try to keep my comments brief here. As Tom said, I am talking about a topic near and dear to my heart, the clean tech, or sometimes referred to as green tech sector. As we talked about in the very first panel, this is a sector that is growing. It's a sector that's attracting interest, obviously, from public policy, but obviously attracting a lot of interest from the venturing community as well. So I'd like to start with just putting some numbers out there for us. $246 billion spent last year worldwide on renewable energy technologies. That's roughly $1 trillion spent in the last 7 years. So this is a large and expanding market. If we look specifically to the venture capital segment, in particular in the U.S., $6.6 billion spent in 2011 in the broader green tech or clean tech sector. Represents a 30% increase over the expenditures in 2010, and by some estimates, roughly a quarter of all U.S. venture capital flowing into, once again, this broad sector often referred to as clean tech or green tech. As was mentioned in the first panel, we are seeing improvements in the technology. We've seen substantial gains in efficiency and cost in solar and wind. Solar, once again, in the last 24 months, seeing a halving of their costs. In some instances, in some applications, wind now being comparable to fossil fuels in terms of cost, even without subsidies. So this is an industry that's growing. Of course, there are still debates about the viability of this industry. Solyndra was mentioned in the earlier panel. Let me just reiterate what was said by our panelists early on. Solyndra, you can argue about the merits of the federal government acting as a venture capitalist, but the failure of Solyndra ultimately was because they could not get their quality up to a point where they had a very high defect rate, and in essence, their cost structure was not competitive with other solar manufacturers. As a business strategy professor, I would argue this is a good thing about the industry here, that we're seeing efficiency gains, we're seeing improvements. The failure of Solyndra is to be expected in an entrepreneurial market like solar. As this industry has grown, has attracted more interest, it's been interesting to me to see from a public policy standpoint that we have many talking about the green economy, and as we've talked about earlier, the ability for it to create jobs. Here's an editorial from the New York Times, a little difficult to read here, Dan Esty and Mike Porter from last year. This is a similar argument we see from many people. To compete globally, we need to encourage clean energy innovation. They go on to propose that an emissions charge, basically a greenhouse gas tax, would be a way to do this. And as they summarize, an entrepreneurial spirit will be unleashed in companies from multinational enterprises to back-of-the-garage inventors. So it's interesting to me that green tech or clean tech now is not only an investment opportunity, but it's also viewed as a way for us to have national competitiveness, job creation, and the like. So this question about spurring demand for the technology is going to lead us to be the innovators in this technology is one very interesting to me as a researcher. You often see senators or governors and others stand up and talk about how, let's say, we need a renewable energy portfolio standard in our state, and if we do so, we will become the Silicon Valley of clean tech or green tech. So we decided to look at this question empirically. What countries are actually leading in green tech innovation, and what are the drivers of that? So all of you have in your portfolios here a briefing that we just released this week looking at this question. So let me share some of that data with you here briefly. So in the center, you will see a map of the world here colored in by different countries in terms of their activity. To highlight what we've done here is we've looked at cumulative patenting across different countries. We've looked at the inventors who submitted those patents and looked at where did they live, basically, and added those up by country. We looked at patents filed across the 3 major exchanges worldwide, the US, the EU, and Japan. And I'll show you some data in a second here that expands even beyond that, which gives us some interesting results. So who's leading in terms of green tech patenting in the world? Well, despite what you might hear, actually the US, and by quite a bit here. If you look in terms of those color bars, those talks about the percentage of all patents filed by US inventors across many of the major categories in the green tech sector. 34% of all wind patents over the last 20 years. 43% of biofuel, 32% of fuel cells, 26% of solar. So once again, the US is a major innovator, the leading innovator, at least by our analysis here, in the green tech sector. Second, we have Japan. So Japan here, Similar in terms of total number of patents. Interesting to see the mix here. Less in wind, much heavier in solar. So roughly 34% of all of our solar innovation. Third, we have Germany, slightly different mix. Much heavier emphasis on wind, less so in terms of solar and biofuels compared to some of the other players. And then rounding out our top 10, we have a number of European economies, France, Great Britain, the Netherlands, a number of Asian economies, Taiwan, South Korea. And just to put a dynamic spin on this, the top line there, the red line, is the US. The next one is Japan. The next one after that is Germany. What you see is increases in patenting over the last 10 years, not surprising. And in some respects, the margins more or less staying the same across these countries, at least over the last 5 years or so. All right, so one country I haven't talked about yet, China. We all know about China's advancements in terms of manufacturing and even adoption of renewable energy technology. How is China doing actually on the innovation side of the technology? Well, the analysis we've done here actually has them as 20th on this list. So again, that might be surprising to some of you. So let's dig a little bit deeper into China here. And in particular, what you're looking at here on this graph is all patents filed in all worldwide exchanges. Now, once again, the US, the EU, and Japan represent over 80% of all the patents are filed in those three exchanges. China, interestingly enough, if we look at patents filed through the Chinese authority, has this huge spike in the last 5 years. In fact, there's been more patents filed in 2008 than in the US and Japan combined. So how do we interpret this? Well, one of my concerns with declaring China the victor here is if you look at what they're doing, I'm sorry, it's a little difficult to read, almost all of those patents that we have worldwide from Chinese inventors are filed in China and only in China. Now, most countries and most inventors tend to file in their home countries, but they also tend to file in other exchanges, especially where you're looking to market and sell the technology. So in the US, for example, over 50% or around 50% of the patents filed in the US are filed by foreign inventors. And there's a lot of reasons why you'd want to get that intellectual property protection in the US. Yet in China, 98% of the patents from Chinese inventors are being filed in China and only in China. Now, China is making strides in terms of their intellectual property protection, but I'm not ready yet to declare that these patents being filed in China are of value on the world stage. And I think it's an open question, something very interesting to look at China moving forward here. Clearly, they've made a lot of investments in terms of their R&D capacity, and they're making as a point of national priority to increase their patenting. In fact, I think in part we're seeing this spike in patenting because they've put local incentives in place to encourage people to submit patents. The question is, what's the value of these patents that we're seeing filed in China? Taking a step back, let me just talk briefly about what we're seeing across some of these different subsectors of Greentech. So if we look once again across different regions, different technologies, the orange bar there is solar. So it's interesting to note, for example, solar versus wind, which is in blue. Now this might lead you to believe there's a lot more innovation occurring in solar than in wind, despite the fact that wind is being adopted at a fairly high rate globally. I think the story here is very simply one about the age of the technology. Wind has been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years. It's been refined over time. We're not seeing a huge amount of patenting in the wind sector as compared to something like solar or photovoltaics, where there's a lot of activity, a lot of R&D, and a lot of patenting subsequently being filed. If we look across different regions, it's interesting to see regional specialization. If you ask me solar, I will tell you East Asia, Japan, Taiwan, China, Korea. If we look at wind, it's Europe, and especially the northern European economies, Denmark, Netherlands, Germany, of course. If we look at biofuels, it's by far and away North America, in particular the US. And then interestingly, if we look at fuel cells, somewhat evenly distributed across the world, or at least the major economies of the world. So what might explain this? Well, one story could be, in the case of wind, it's the adoption of the technology. They've been long adopters of this technology, and it's making them a more innovative area in terms of this. In biofuels, we can tell a public policy story about our subsidies for ethanol that's driving innovation in the US in biofuels. We also obviously have a large agricultural capability here as a country. In terms of why Asia and solar, well, that might be a story about microelectronics, microprocessors, and their ability to have the high-end technology that is necessary, especially in solar photovoltaics. What's interesting, if we start to look at adoption versus innovation, so the adoption of this technology versus who's innovating, there's clearly a correlation, but it's not a very strong correlation. There are regions of the world like Asia that are heavy innovators in solar PV, but they're not the largest adopters of solar PV. There's obviously some countries of developing economies, even places like Morocco, who have heavily adopted the technology but have almost no innovation that we observe. So there's a disconnect here between adoption and innovation that I feel is sometimes not recognized in the popular discussions about the green tech sector. So we're beginning follow-up work digging into the US to try to understand, well, what is actually driving the innovation side of the technology versus the adoption side. So this is not in the briefing shared with you today. This is data on the US. What you're seeing here is each red dot represents a patent filed in the US by a US inventor and their location that they live. You can see here clusters in Silicon Valley, San Francisco area, LA, many of our large metropolitan areas, but you also see interesting clusters in places like northern New Mexico, around many of the Department of Energy labs that are there. So we've begun doing some modeling and actually regression analysis to try to tease out what are the drivers that explain these patterns. Why do we see clusters in some areas versus others? On one side, you have a demand side argument, or what we call a demand side pull, which says it's going to be those regions that have aggressively adopted the technology, maybe have high energy prices and therefore incentivized to try to come up with solutions, and in particular have public policies encouraging the adoption of renewable energy. On the other side, we have supply side push. Now, these might be subsidies for actual R&D. It might be large research universities in place, a rich entrepreneurial ecosystem, even have some data and some measures that we have on kind of intrinsic motivation. Is it that there's a lot of tree huggers, if you will, in an area that's determining where we see innovation. So once again, this is preliminary work, but where we're finding evidence is we're finding very weak evidence that the demand level drivers matter. At the end of the day, it tends to be the supply side drivers. When people ask me, where's the Silicon Valley of Greentech going to be? The answer is Silicon Valley. Lots of activity taking place there. Why is it taking place there? For all the reasons that we've seen a lot of innovation in Silicon Valley in the past. World-class universities, highly educated workforce, availability of venture capital. At the end of the day, a rich entrepreneurial ecosystem. So when we go back out to considerations of kind of national competitiveness, I think we have to really seriously consider what are the policies we are adopting to try to encourage the innovation side of the equation. And at the end of the day, it might very well be that incentives adopted by the government in Germany for solar adoption leads to manufacturing in China and innovation in the US. So we get back to this question of job creation and the types of jobs that we want to create. It's important that we think back to this point and question about innovation and what actually drives innovation at the end of the day. Because in a global marketplace, that value chain between adoption, manufacturing, and innovation can be globally distributed and would be expected to be globally distributed. All right, let me end there. Do we have time at all for a question or two? So let me end there. Are there any questions for the analysis that we've conducted?
I'd like to sort of think about the patenting in China versus the non-patenting everywhere else. And it seems to me, if one's a conspiracy theorist, one could suggest that the reason you patent anywhere or patent in China is to get a time-stamped prior art, so no one can compete on innovation, but you only compete on manufacturing costs.
Well, I think that's what's peculiar about this, right? We were talking about first to file here. So if you think you are going to sell your technology primarily in let's say, Western Europe or in the U.S., you would want intellectual property protection there, or you risk being able to defend your technology in the court of law. So it's not clear to me that establishing that, especially under first to file in China, gives you any rights within these other economies. Yeah. It's an interesting point. It's an interesting point. I'd have to think about that more, whether that's what's going on here. I've talked to actually a number of scholars who specifically understand and do research in the Chinese intellectual property area. And I think everyone comes to an agreement that, look, China is making investments. We're seeing increases in R&D. Those are going to be increasing in terms of their innovative output in the years coming forward. Where they stand currently is somewhere between first and 20th, right? And the idea that they're kind of doubling the innovative output of these other Western economies in Japan seems highly unlikely at this point. So there is a question here again about the value of the patents that are being generated. But I don't want to undersell the role that China is playing here moving forward in this space.
Hey, Mike.
Yeah.
I'll just go ahead and yell from here. Good to see you. More general question. So as you were just talking about, where's the Silicon Valley of clean tech?
Yeah.
Well, it looks like it's in the Silicon Valley. And on the one hand, being from Silicon Valley, that feels like a good answer. On the other hand, being Virginian and Virginia graduate,
Yeah.
like to see more entrepreneurship here. I thought, oh crap, not another one. How do we spread the wealth, so to speak, or said another way, does this monopoly that Silicon Valley seems to have on being the leading center of innovation in tech need to continue versus other areas? I know it's a broader question than just clean tech, but I'd love to hear your perspective.
Well, it goes back again to this demand versus supply side again. There are a number of reasons why it would be good for various states to adopt, once again, renewable energy portfolio standards for their states. This increases aggregate demand and encourages innovation more broadly across the globe in the technology. And there's environmental reasons and others that we want to have those types of regulations in place. But if you're really interested in, this question about being the Silicon Valley of Greentech, what our data is suggesting is investment in things like, and I know it sounds self-serving standing here as a professor from UVA, but investment in world-class universities, federal R&D for maybe through the NSF and the like in green technology, the Department of Energy, encouraging rich ecosystems through the encouragement of venture capital and the like. I don't know if anyone's cracked the nut on how to create the next Silicon Valley. If you look out there, there are many attempts to create these types of entrepreneurial ecosystems. In fact, the Jefferson Innovation Summit, which has been mentioned, in part was trying to understand how do we create those types of ecosystems. And one quick plug, we're working with the governor's office now to do the second Jefferson Innovation Summit that's going to focus on the Commonwealth of Virginia as, in essence, a case study of what state and local governments can do to try to encourage these types of ecosystems. So there's a series of things that people have discussed along the lines that I just talked about how to create them. But it's challenging. It's a competitive marketplace to create these types of ecosystems as well.
Great, thank you. Hey, one other thing. I just want to say publicly a thank you because when we're talking about developing entrepreneurship programs at the University of Virginia, as some of you know in the room, I've been very active with the engineering school to do just that. Tom's office has been great, but Darden stepped up with very tangible support on bringing in instructional resources into the engineering school to help educate engineers who want to remain on the technical side just to get some business fundamentals. And so your leadership, not just in Darden, but university-wide, is appreciated and tangible. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I do want to give a shout out. They were sitting up here before. Here's MJ, Tom's. We have Philip Summer, who headed the Batten Institute Center for Entrepreneurial Leadership, and they have been incredible drivers of some of these cross-campus initiatives that Tom had made. So I am fortunate to work with wonderful colleagues to help with that process. So we have not done the level of analysis that I would like to do on the country level. And one of the challenges and why we're looking at first in the detailed modeling side of what we're doing at the state level within the U.S. is because across countries there are such institutional variance, it gets very hard to tease out what are the actual factors that are driving why the U.S. versus Japan versus Germany. We can think anecdotally about which countries have which policies. Germany comes to mind, of course, as one has been very forward in terms of, once again, adoption of technology and is also a leader in innovation across a number of different sectors. But we haven't done that systematically yet.
Thank you. You've created this amazing image of an interdependent cycle of adoption, manufacturing, and innovation. And it seems like it's a global interdependency. Can we cultivate more local food chains, if you will, that would address the diverse human community's need for a diversity of jobs that also range from adoption to manufacturing and innovation? Because if we can't, my concern is that we're kind of consigning whole countries, whole communities to either being an adopter, either being manufacturing, either being an innovator, and what are the implications of that to the social, economic, and quality of life of our human communities?
I think that's the critical question. Take wind, for example. So what are the job creation opportunities through wind? Well, the actual operation of a wind farm requires very few people. I mean, we're talking, a dozen jobs being created by a large wind farm. There is jobs created in the construction of that wind farm that are somewhat temporal, and that does require a lot of kind of construction-oriented jobs. There's the manufacturing side of that as well, and then, of course, there's this innovation side. One of the things we're looking at, and we're very early stages of this, I'm very interested in the evolution of entrepreneurial ventures in this space. At least anecdotally, we've seen a number of US-based entrepreneurial ventures get bought out by foreign multinationals. That's an interesting question. Is that problematic when we think about job creation in the US or not? Or is that a fine kind of exit strategy for these ventures, and we're accepting of that? We do have some obviously large players out of the US as well. But it's an interesting ecology, if you will, of the ventures themselves. And we talked earlier about job creation is that scaling up phase. Are they getting cut off before they scale up by being bought out by foreign multinationals? And once again, is that a good thing or a bad thing for the U.S. and economic competitiveness? I don't have a good answer for you yet, but it's definitely something we were looking to research further going forward.